We are approaching the end of May, and this is the time of year where fishing starts to become tough. Fishing pressure is taking its toll, and the fish are really setting up in places where they're going to spend the next couple of months, and it's hard to catch them. It's hard to get a bite. June, July, those are the dog days of summer, and the fishing is just really going to be not easy. So there's a few scenarios that I want to talk about today that are important, because you may go to your lake or a new lake and not get hardly any clues, not catch any fish during your practice period. And how do you go and fish a tournament when you're not catching anything in practice? You have to pick up on these little nuances that you may see during the day that could be all the difference in your success in the tournament or just out there fishing and having a good time. So a mud line is one that you hear a lot about, but that's very confusing because it really shouldn't even be called a mud line. It should be called like where clear water meets dirty water. And if it's the right scenario, then there will be fish there. But most of the time, if you just have muddy water meeting clear water and it's not around a specific structure that should be holding fish, the fish aren't really going to relate to it. So I'm going to give you a few examples of mudlines that will have fish and mudlines that are just going to make you waste time fishing them. So a couple scenarios that come to mind is like, let's say you're in a dead end creek, you're way back in a creek and you're fishing back, and the water's dirty, and then it starts to clear. Right there where that water starts clearing, that's where there will be a population of fish. Because if you think about it, you're going to have fish that when they're in clear water, they'll swim anywhere. And once they hit that dirty water, they'll stop. So instead of there just being maybe one or two fish that are passing through, you'll have a stopping point for a bunch of fish that would be passing through until they get to that dirty water, so they stop. So anytime you're fishing along, it just doesn't feel right, you're not catching them, and that water goes from, let's say, 6 inches or less of visibility to like 10 inches of visibility, the slightest difference, but you can start seeing a little bit more down in the water. That little difference will be where those fish will be at. And that's not always going to be a mud line. It might not be muddy water. It might just be a little bit darker water. And then you get into clear and those fish will be right there on that line. Another thing that happens when it comes to what you would call a mud line is, let's say there's a population of fish that live in a pocket, like they're in off the main lake or in a creek arm, and it's just a big pocket. There may be a point and a saddle that is in the middle of the pocket with a couple drains on each side. Now those fish will use those drains, they'll use those points. When they spawn, they may be anywhere in those pockets. And when you have an influx of water from rain and it muddies up the backs of those pockets, and let's say you get a bunch of rain, so it just muddies up the entire pocket, that population of fish that's in that pocket will swim out to the mouth. Now, so if you're always catching them in the back of that pocket and you're running to the pocket and you go, man, I always catch one here, I didn't even practice here, I'm just going to go back there and fish, and you're running up to it and you start getting near it and you're in clear water, and then it gets dirty, stop. I mean, that's where those fish are all going to be pushed. Now, what will happen is if they're just pushed out into the, right out into the middle of the creek, you're not going to catch them if they're just, can't get on anything. But if there's, let's say, a big point or a shell bed or something that's right out there where those fish, when they're leaving their slough or their back of their pocket where they live, they come out to that, out of the dirty water into the clear water, then you can catch them if they get on something. And that's when you will typically have the best days on those types of spots, because you're running to that place and every fish that would be, just all over that big bay have all kind of congregated and come out to one thing. And that spot that you're catching them off of, like if it's a shell bed out in front of that slough or a point, that might be the only time that point or that shell bed is good, when there's a bunch of rain. So you might pull up there, catch one and go, all right, well, I'm going to fish this point or this shell bed every time. And that might be totally a conditional type spot. And I think you see that a lot of times on lakes where you have a good population of resident fish and you have a good population of schooling lake fish. Now, the difference between those two, resident fish are going to be dark. Typically, they're going to be skinnier, and the lake fish, the lake fish or the schooling fish rather, whatever you want to call them, are going to be much whiter. They don't, sit under a log. They don't lay up in the grass. They're not underneath a mat. They're not in the shade, just sitting in one spot. They're swimming all over the lake. And for that reason, those fish bite more. They're easier to catch. They're more conditioned. They're less conditional when it comes to if you have a front or a bunch of rain or muddy water. Those fish are constantly in the clear water and they're swimming around. Now, those fish, you're typically going to catch them off of spots. Good spots are going to have those fish. Spots where they can feed, spots where they seek refuge, whatever it may be. But those are spot places oriented fish. The resident fish are just going to be way in the back of a creek. They're going to be somewhere where they're not getting a lot of fishing pressure and they can just slow their metabolism down. They don't eat every day. They'll stay in that muddy water. They're not always going to follow the clear water out. You probably can't catch them when the water gets real muddy. They just sit back there. Unless you have them on like an isolated target, like a stump or in a mat or something, when that water gets real dirty, they just shut off. And that's why they're much skinnier, much unhealthier looking than those other fish that probably eat something every day. They're swimming around a lot. Their metabolism is up. And those are the two different kinds of fish you have to catch. And mudlines are really not mudlines. They're either a piece of structure that has fish holding on there because you have a bunch of clear water intersecting with dirty water, or you are fishing an area that has a bunch of water that isn't good, and then there's a stopping point with that dirtier water leads to clear. That's where a lot of those fish will be. So those are little things that if you have a tough practice, you're not catching them, and you find that out there on the tournament day, don't run by it. It can be one of those deals where they're piled up in there. You can catch a limit in 30 minutes or less and can make you a really good tournament, because a lot of times you're not going to get a bunch of clues in your practice. You're going to go out there, it's going to be tough, and those one little things, like areas or clues that can lead you into just catching them off of one spot, is all the difference. It saves you on those days that are going to be really tough tournaments for you. They can become good tournaments. You just got to pay attention, fish in the moment, and just don't be afraid to do something that makes sense. So try that, guys. Good luck to you, and I'll see you on the water.